Okay, we're live. So um, we are basically to First Chronicles. We talked a lot about David uh, as he's making preparations. Um, Talked about how that growing old is not always uh, fun, but we'll be kind of glancing through. We won't be reading as much today for a while. First Chronicles 23. We'll kind of look at. Um, But David's doing a lot of preparation for his son. Now, we don't know exactly when these things took place. Uh, we've already been to where Abiathar and oh, what's the where they tried to set up king when it had already been determined. Adonijah. Adonijah tried to become king, one of David's sons. And of course, we looked last week where it had already been settled that God had decreed that Solomon be the next king. David had stated that he'd be the next king. And so we went through that where David was very old. And although by our standards, he wasn't what we'd consider very old, he's probably late 60s, almost 70, because he dies at 70 years old. But, people go down at different times. We talked some about that. But, sometimes it's a thing. So these things, obviously, David was still active enough he could do all this. But that doesn't mean it was a long time before that. Uh, you look at Jimmy Carter passed away yesterday, 100 years old. But if you look, yeah, Jimmy Carter, died yesterday.
What?
No,
I thought he died here a few months ago.
no, he was just in real bad shape. He's been in hospice for 2 years.
Uh,
Yeah, his wife died a few years ago, and he's been under hospice for 2 years, which he didn't. I mean, they showed a picture of him. They wheeled him into the voting booth to vote in the election, and he really did not look well at all. But the thing is, you can go back like when Biden was first elected, he went and visited uh, Jimmy and Rosalind Carter, and they still looked okay then, and he was still able to do things. In 2018, when George H.W. Bush died, he was at the funeral and even spoke. So, he really, into his mid 90s, Jimmy Carter was still a very pretty active person. He still went to church regularly. He did other things, but sometimes that age it just almost hits you overnight. And so David may have been like that. David may have been fine up to a point, and then at some point, no one really knows when that's going to hit. It hits people at different times. And sometimes it's not just a immediate thing, but sometimes it is. I mean, sometimes you've known people that you know very active and whatever. Then something happens, and next thing you know, they're old. I mean, they just no longer can do the things they once could do. So David, we don't know how long this was before Solomon becomes king. It may have been a year, 2 years, 3 years. We don't know for sure. It'd be only a guess. But he was still uh, vibrant enough, alert enough to where he could do uh, functions of a king to set up uh, these things. So, in First Chronicles 23, we'll just kind of look through this and gloss through this a little bit, and really just look at the headings. It says David organizes the Levites. In 23:1, it says, when David was old and full of days, he made Solomon his son king over Israel. And we know that he did that, although we saw that Adonijah tried to take the kingship. David assembled all the leaders of Israel and the priests and the Levites. The Levites, 30 years old and upward, were numbered, and their total was 38,000 men. 24,000 of these, David said, shall have charge of work in the house of the Lord. So anyway, we go through this. 30, once again, was that magical number when they felt like you had studied enough, knew enough, to represent people as a Levite or a priest as well. And then for the priest, we also talked about in the law of Moses that once they hit 50, they kind of were no longer in active duty as far as doing the responsibilities of priesthood. We discussed it a little bit. Why was it the case that priests basically no longer were doing the daily activities that they originally were to do? Why did that cease at age of 50? What did the priest have to do?
Too much lifting.
Yeah. Yeah, I know I've talked to Steve, and Steve younger than me, but Steve has told me that it takes a lot more out of him to do what he used to do pretty easily. He has to take a break every now and then. The stamina is just not the same. And lifting heavy pieces of meat, and in the cases of the priests, they were cutting up oxes, cattle, and sheep, heavy sheep and other things. And, it's very manual intensive. And so what it was set up was once you turn 50, you didn't do that type of stuff anymore. And so they would have the younger men do it and raise them up. We don't really have a parallel of that in church today because, it doesn't take a lot of, lifting to sing a song, to pass out the Lord's Supper trays, or to even preach. But we
You hadn't called me sleeping yet, have you?
no, I ain't caught you sleeping yet. But it's a good thing. It's a good thing to have young people trained and ready to take over the next roles. But the reason it was so young, of course, first of all, a lot of times they didn't live as long at some point in stages, and secondly, it just was a thing that physically, it was a very physically demanding job. So anyway, so David orders these and sets them up. What was the distinction between the Levites and the priests? So what did they were obviously all from Levi, but the priests were a little different. So who did the priests descend from? Because Levites were just simply of a tribe of Levi. Well, a lot of people were tribe of Levi, but the priest, it was more specific. Who were they descendants of? Who was the first high priest? Okay. Remember back when we studied Exodus, you had Moses, that's when it all started, right? And who did God tell Moses to make that set up as the high priest? And then he had two sons, Nadab and Abihu, that offered up the strange fire in Leviticus 10, and they were struck down by fire from God. Who was their dad? So who was the two leaders of Israel in the Exodus?
I'd be just guessing. I'm thinking Jacob.
No, Jacob was long dead before that. So who were the leaders that brought them up out of the Exodus? Moses told God into the fiery bush, God, I'm not very eloquent of my words. So who did God say would be his spokesperson? You're going to kick yourselves when I tell you.
I know who you're talking about.
Yeah, it's his brother Aaron.
Aaron.
So Aaron was the first priest, and the priesthood in the law of Moses was sometimes it's known as the Aaronic Aaron, and then add Aaronic priesthood. So all priests were descendants of Aaron. So you couldn't be a priest unless you're descendant of Aaron. Now, when the kingdoms divide, we'll see that Jeroboam tried to set it up to where anyone could be priest, but that's not in the law of Moses. Only those who were descendants of Aaron. So it's a smaller group than the overall Levites. So the priests, we understand their role. They were to offer the sacrifices up. They were to light the candles and stuff, the incense, burn the incense. They were to prepare the showbread and put it out before the altar, and then they would, that's what they would eat as well.
There was things they could do too.
There was things they couldn't do, but what did the Levites do? What was their role? The priests, we understand, they offered the sacrifices, they did those type of things in the tabernacle and even the temple itself. They're the ones that went inside it. The high priest could go into the most holy place once a year, Day of Atonement. But what about the Levites? What did they do?
Yeah, the heavy stuff.
Okay, well, yeah, they did the grunt labor, you might say. So in the days of the tabernacle, of course, tabernacle is just a fancy word for what? What was the tabernacle? We've retained that word, but it simply means something we're all familiar with. What was the tabernacle? Now, it was a nice one. I think we've used this word. They got this word called glamping now, but that's what that tabernacle was looked at because it was fancy. But what is a tabernacle? Your newer translations a lot of times won't even call it tabernacle. They'll say, or sometimes even in the older translations, there was times that it would say, instead of tabernacle, it would say tent of meeting. So it was a tent. I mean, that's all it was. So it was portable. Why was the original tabernacle tent, why was it designed to be portable during the early days of the law of Moses?
They was always moving around.
They were moved, yeah. Yeah, especially those 40 years when they were, wandering in the wilderness. Yeah. So they would have to pick it up. Well, who did the bulk of that? Who did the manual labor of taking it down and putting it up and all that type of stuff? Well, it was the Levites. Who carried the Ark of the Covenant when it needed to be carried? It was the Levites, and they had the long pole so they could touch it, but they would be the ones. David figured that out, and that's why things changed when he was able to finally get the Ark into Jerusalem. So what did the Levites do during this era when the tabernacle had been fixed? It's down in the Jerusalem area, and so what did they do? Really didn't have a whole lot, did they? So David sets up, there was a bunch of them. So David sets up a setup where what their roles would be once the temple would be built. No longer traveling here and there. The temple would be stationary. And so basically what a lot of these things are, he is organized Levites for what they will do when the temple is built. Priests, there's so many priests now, though, they will be there'll be different divisions based on who their head of clan was, and they would rotate. Remember John the Baptist's dad, Zacharias? It was his time to serve, and he drew the lot of burning the incense. And so they would rotate it around. So a lot of this was set up by David as far as how this would be done, a structure, an order. Now, did David do this on his own whim, or did he have some guidance in doing this?
I figure he was one that was get people that he wanted to move stuff and purchase.
Now, whether or not he was directly guided, I don't know, but I don't think in these things he did it without God's approval. So these things were set up so that this new era, when the temple would be built, it would be set up. So in chapter 24, he's dealt with the Levites, and now we'll see he organizes the priests in chapter 24. Divisions of the sons of Aaron were these. Now, once again, sons of Aaron, that's the priest. The sons of Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. Now, what happened to Nadab and Abihu?
Use strange fire.
Yeah, it burned the incense, and God struck them down with fire. So they had no children. Well, in fact, it says, verse 2, but Nadab and Abihu died before their father and had no children. So Eleazar and Ithamar became priests. So all the priests of the law of Moses in the Old Testament and even into the New Testament came through Eleazar and Ithamar. In verse 3, with the help of Zadok, of the sons of Eleazar, and Ahimelech of the sons of Ithamar, David organized them according to the appointed duties and service. Since more chief men were found among the sons of Eleazar than among the sons of Ithamar, they organized them under 16 heads of fathers' houses of the sons of Eleazar, and 8 of the sons of Ithamar. So there were 16 and 8, so that's 24 total. And they divided them by lot, all alike. They were sacred officers and officers of God among both the sons of Eleazar and sons of Ithamar. And so here we see, and we start seeing in verse 7. In verse 7, we start seeing these divisions, the way they go. Let's turn your Bibles to Luke chapter 1. Luke 1.
Right? That's that one you got yesterday, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Man, that dude.
Yeah.
That's all.
Jim don't have it either.
Yeah, I don't have, no, you got the fancy one.
Yeah.
Dale got a fancy one, got the thumb index, yeah.
Makes it easier to find the books.
We have after Mark.
Pages ain't doing it what I wanted to do.
Yeah, they stick together with their.
Luke chapter 1.
Luke chapter 1, yes.
Luke chapter, I found Luke.
Now, Luke 2 is where you'll find the birth of Jesus. Luke 1, at the end of Luke 1, you deal with Mary and the angel telling her, Gabriel telling her that she's going to be with child. And then she goes to see her cousin, Elizabeth, who is John the Baptist's mother. But the first of Luke 1 deals with Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist. And so in verse 5 of Luke 1, did you find it yet, Martin?
Just about it.
Yeah.
Getting close.
The answer. Yeah.
Right after this one.
Yeah. Yeah. The best thing to get those to unstick is use it.
Yeah,
So is to use it. The more you use it, it'll start getting better.
I can't do that.
Well,
Go do this.
well, you'll be
Go do
here.
that.
We'll be here, so we'll get you. Please use it. Yeah, that's true. Anyway, Luke 1 and verse 5, it says, in the days of Herod, king of Judea. Now, there's a lot of Herods in the New Testament. This was Herod the Great, the one that tried to kill all the did kill all the babies in Bethlehem because he thought Jesus was still there. There was a priest named Zechariah. So to be priest, he had to be a son of Aaron, of the division of Abijah. And he had a wife from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. So Elizabeth was also a descendant, and her dad was obviously a priest as well. And they were both righteous before God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and statutes of the Lord. By the way, because of that, we know since she was of that her mother likely was not from the tribe of Levi, was not of the sons of Aaron. Her mother likely had to have been of the tribe of Judah, because Mary was from the tribe of Judah. And so anyway, and they were related. At least that's what the thought is. So he was of the division of Abijah. So let's turn back to 1 Chronicles 24. So you were smart there. Awesome. So they tabbed it. They put their bookmark there. 1 Chronicles 24. Okay. Okay, you got it. So Zacharias, the father of John the Baptist as well would have been, although he never served in the priesthood, was of the division of Abijah. Where did these divisions come from? They came from the way David organized them based on the heads of the families. And so let's look at verse 7. It says the first lot to Jehoram, the second to Jediah, third to Haram, the fourth to Serorim, the fifth to Malchijah, sixth to Magidimim, the second to Hakaz, the eighth to Abijah. So, indeed, this was one of the divisions that David had set up. We're in 1 Chronicles 24. Yeah. And so this indeed was one of the divisions that David had set up. And so we know a little bit more. You can actually trace the lineage of Zacharias, John the Baptist, much like the lineage of Jesus is told. You could do that with John the Baptist as well, because we've got Abijah, and then obviously he was at some point and I'm not sure you could trace, they've got all this in the Chronicles, different places. But anyway, so this is where this came from. Now, descendants of Moses were Levites, but not priests. So even though Moses had a more substantial role in the Exodus, and as the one that many refer to as the lawgiver, because he was one given the commandments to give to the Israelites, his children did not have the same role. The priest had a more prominent role and a lot more responsibility. So any thoughts or questions about that? We're going to go on to chapter 25.
And you said Moses and Aaron were brothers?
They were brothers, yes. Yeah, Aaron was his older brother. And so anyway, we understand that. So we'll go on to chapter 25 now, and there's something I want to talk about there. 1 Chronicles 25. And the heading says, David organizes the musicians. Where will you find musicians in the Law of Moses in the first 5 books? Anything about musicians? You won't. Okay. So this is new. This is different. So this is the first time music of any form is mentioned as far as service. Now, my guess is it had already been done in the tabernacle, or when they would worship, they were probably using instruments. But this is very specific. Now, just as preface, a lot of people will sometimes use this and say, well, David used instruments. They used instruments in the temple. And that's true. And so we're going to talk about that some. One thing I want to point out, though, is it was very, very prescribed what instruments they were to use. So they didn't just use any instruments. And a lot of this is set up here as far as which instruments could be used, and not only that, when they could be used. What you find in Scripture always is Scripture is usually very specific of what is required to please God. And so you don't ever add to or take away. Much like Nadab and Abihu found out. God had a prescribed way. He wanted the fire to be where it came from. It was to come from the coals of the altar of burnt offering, and that's what they were used to burn the incense. Don't know how they did it. They did it differently. So those that want to use this as why we could use instruments today, it's faulty, for one, because it was very specific in how it's to be done. they say, well, where's the specifics in the New Testament? Well, there is specifics, but it specifically mentions our voices only. So when you go by the specifics, it really dictates things. But we got other issues in this. So let's look at 1 Chronicles 25. David and the chiefs of the service also set apart for the service the sons of Asaph. Now, what's interesting about this Asaph, if you've ever read any of the Psalms, if you read enough of them, you'll eventually come to one about, it's almost ascribed to Asaph as the writer, or it's devoted to Asaph. That's these musical sons. Zachar, Joseph, Nethaniah, and Asarel, sons of Zophah, under the direction of Asaph, who prophesied under the direction of the king. So they apparently were gifted with ability to prophesy and to sing well. And so he sets these up. In verse 6 of 1 Chronicles 25, it says, they were all under the direction of the Father in the music in the house of the Lord. And here's the instruments that they would use: cymbals, harps, and lyres for the service of the house of God. And so that was the only instruments that they could use, and that's what they did. And there was 288 of them. So their duties were great. Anyway, so this lists those. Now,
Before David made this decision, didn't he play the harp all along?
he played the lyre, yes, which is
Oh, the
a
lyre.
little. It's kind of like a mini harp. Yeah.
I was going to ask you, what is that? I don't know.
It's if you see a lot of the movies that deal with even ancient Greek culture and stuff like that, it's like a mini harp. So it doesn't have as many strings to it, and you could hold it. It was small enough to hold it, and you would play it like.
Rita played something
Let's read
like
it
that.
on that.
Well, the harpsichord it's very similar. I guess would be the modern equivalent of this type of lyre. So it's got, using the harpsichord's got like a buttons.
Got
You can do
buttons,
chords, and then you can
buttons.
strum it. Yeah, but it's basically made on the premise of a lyre, what a lyre would be. And so, you go up to Branson, Silver City, they'll sell them to you if you want to buy one. But they're kind of neat. I mean, but that's what David played the lyre. And so those would be lyres, more portable than a big full harp and everything. Easier to make too. But if you look at 1 Chronicles 25 and you go to about verse 7-ish, these were trained in singing to the Lord, and skillful was 288. Look over to the left and you'll see a number that says 2470. The Thompson musicians, yeah. Everybody find it? We're not going to go back to where that's at, but we're going to kind of change our direction just a little bit. In 1 Chronicles 23:5, it said, 4,000 gatekeepers, 4,000 shall offer praises to the Lord with instruments that I have made for praise. Well, who is speaking there? That's David. David made these things. Now, we're going to get into a discussion here because I think it's an interesting discussion, and I'm not going to say that necessarily it's the right answer, because it could be that God allowed this, but God didn't authorize it. But let's just read and see what we think. So in Amos 6:5, there's a lot of people that will turn to that, in fact, to say instruments were never authorized, and that's why we can't use them today. I think that is a faulty argument. The biggest reason we can't use them today is because it doesn't matter what they did in the law of Moses. We don't burn incense. We don't offer animal sacrifices. We don't have priests that are just of a bloodline of a certain family. We are not required to be circumcised. We don't have to observe the feast days that they did. Why don't we? Well, because we live under a new law, and we have our own guidance as to what we're to do. Things that are important to us, we take a Lord's Supper each and every Lord's Day. And the items are prescribed, the unleavened bread and the fruit of the vine. We sing with our voices. That's what we're told in the New Testament. Yeah. So there's a lot of things that we are told specific that is different. We meet anywhere. We don't have to go to Jerusalem. We could worship in in a brush arbor, as some used to do. We can meet under a tent. We can just be out in the open. It doesn't matter where we're at. We can worship anywhere. We've done it at the park before. There's nothing wrong with that. So it's a lot different. And it's different because it's a new covenant, a new age, the law of Christ as opposed to the law of Moses. That's why we can't use instruments today. So some of this may be an academic exercise, but it really has no emphasis on it. Some will say, well, in heaven, it talks about being a sound of these instruments. Well, first of all, a lot of Revelation is figurative. So is it the sound or is it the actual instrument? I don't know. But even if it is the actual instrument, does that really have any bearing on us today? Well, once again, no. What else is not in heaven? When they asked Jesus this convoluted question about if, the brother's, a brother's wife, brother had passed away and his wife was still alive. And under law of Moses, the, next in line brother is supposed to take her as his wife. Well, then they kept going, what if they had 4 or 5 times? And then in heaven, because these are Sadducees, they didn't believe in the resurrection. They said, well, in heaven, then whose wife is she then? Because she would have had several husbands of the same family. And what did Jesus tell the Sadducees then about heaven? It'd be as the angels. And what about angels? There's no marriage or giving into marriage. So it's no longer a thing. What was the purpose of marriage? Really, there's 2 primary purposes of marriage. What are the 2 primary roles of marriage? So in the very beginning, you had Adam and Eve. Well, you had Adam, excuse me. And Adam is naming all these animals, and there's pairs of them and everything, and there wasn't a companion for Adam. He was lonely, right? So what did God do? Caused him to fall asleep, took a rib, and made a woman. He was excited about it. As a helpmeet, someone that was equal but opposite. And really, that's the language there that's used. So could fill in the voids. So that is number 1 for companionship. But what was the second primary reason for marriage as God instituted? What were they to be? Well, yes, that's the way marriage works. But they were what else? They were to be fruitful and multiply. So what were they to do? They were to have children. I mean, that was the purpose. So God made us biological in the sense that, that is the way we, add to the population. Think about Adam and Eve. They were all alone, so they needed children. The world needed to grow. When they land on dry ground, what were they told to do? Be fruitful and multiply again, because the world was down to 8 people. So, marriage was to procreate, to have children, and to companionship. And then there was guidelines about marriage, how it's to be. Obviously, 1 man for 1 woman for life. But that was the primary role of marriage way back in the day.
Have kids and boss.
Have kids and a boss. No, that's Marvin's translation there. No. But anyway, so we see the different roles that things have had. So these musicians, let's look at Amos 6:5. You don't have to turn there, I'll just read it. But Amos there writes, the prophet, who sing idle songs to the sound of the harp, and like David, invent for themselves instruments of music. Well, some have contend thereby, the prophet is saying that David wasn't authorized to do this, that these were wrong, these instruments. But now, I want us to understand that Amos, in the context there, is talking about how that they were not worshiping God with the heart anymore. And so it had become a show, a production. It wasn't always their best. It was ways to make it look good. Do people do that today, by the way?
To entertain others.
Yeah. You know,
They do everything you're reading here.
yeah. Sadly, Jerry Wilkins told me that at funerals when they have congregational singing now, there's only two groups that he's okay with that when they say they're going to have congregational singing. Said there's no other places in town that know how to do congregational singing. By the way, I don't think there's I think it's interesting that the two are Churches of Christ and the Primitive Baptists. Well, what's unique about the Primitive Baptists? They also do not use instruments.
I figured they use it.
No, they do not. The Primitive Baptists do not. They have a lot that they're misguided on, but one thing they do, they don't use instruments. So they sing really well. And so, by the way, a lot of times people say, well, the Church of Christ, you're the only ones to do this, that. But everything we do, someone does it. It's just that we do everything based on what Scripture says. And some people do some, don't do others. But basically, most people that consider themselves Christians have lost the ability to sing in a group setting because what do most in Christendom, what do they have now? So if you went to a Baptist church, you went to the Catholic church, you went to wherever, how is the singing done? Or who does it?
Band.
Yeah, they got bands now. They got like rock bands. They get up there and jam out, and people just listen. And that never was what it was to be. Well, Amos, I think, is dealing with some of that mentality that it had become a show. It had become something that wasn't heartfelt. And so as a result, he mentions that David invented for themselves instruments and music. There's a big difference in between other people doing that and what David did. But anyway, I'm going to read from Adam Clark, who was he's one of the, he was considered a scholar back in the day, and he was of the Methodists, the early 1800s, up to, I think, about 1830, 1840, 1850, somewhere in that time frame. And he did a lot of writing. He wrote commentaries on pretty much the entire Bible. There's some good things he has in the Old Testament, especially. Occasionally something good in the New Testament as well. But so his commentary on Amos 6:5, he says about, where it says in the event instruments music like David, and he says, see note, 1 Chronicles 20-5, and especially note on 2 Chronicles 29-25. We're going to talk about that in a second. I believe David was not authorized by the Lord to introduce that multitude of musical instruments into divine worship, of which we read, and I am satisfied that his conduct in this respect is most solemnly reprehended by this prophet. By the way, they spoke a lot more eloquent back in the 1800s, 1830s. And I further believe that the use of such instruments in the Christian church is without sanction, and against the will of God. They are subversive to the spirit of true devotion, and that they are sinful. Now, wait a second. Let's. What did I say this Adam Clark was? He wasn't part of the Churches of Christ. What did I say he was? He was Methodist. And what did he say? He said that it was subversive to use instruments of music during a worship service. That would surprise a lot of people. I dare say, there's a Methodist church here in town. I would dare say, if you told them, by the way, I guarantee it, if you go to wherever their church library is, they've got his whole commentary series and other books written by Adam Clark. He is well known. He's probably one of the greatest known Methodist preachers that has ever lived. But if you went in there, you'd find this commentary. In fact, you could probably look this up, show it to them, and they would be shocked. They would be shocked. You look at people like Charles Spurgeon, probably the most well-known Baptist preacher of, probably even still today, because he preached at what was a mega church back in London in the 1700s. And he was so well-known. Apparently was a really good orator, wrote a lot of books, wrote commentaries, and he also says, nothing wrong with the piano as long as it's not anywhere near the worship. Yeah. And And all these of the what's referred to as Protestants were against instruments of music. They didn't enter into the U.S. until sometime in the 1800s, mid 1800s, and that's when most of your denominations started using them. The Church of Christ, we weren't spared from having a dispute over that. Of course, the Christian church broke away from us because they wanted to have instruments. But it was something that was never done. The early church didn't use them. In fact, a lot of people point out to the fact that the first time instruments were ever put into any kind of church building, Christian church building, was in the 600s, under really the first Pope Gregory. But even then, it wasn't used universally. In fact, they refer to him as Saint Thomas, just Thomas Aquinas. He was a bishop, had a large area that he was over. And he had, in his commentaries and stuff that he wrote in the 1200s, he said, "You'll never find an instrument in one of my churches that I'm over." He said, "It's, something should be anathema. It should be accursed and everything." And that was even the Roman Catholic Church. And so over time, the Renaissance age, instruments became popular in the Roman Catholic Church. But it wasn't in the Protestant churches. They didn't want it because it's not what Scripture said. So it wasn't until the mid. But anyway, I'm going to read a little bit farther what it says. If there was a woe to them who invented instrument music, as did David in the law, is there no woe, no curse to them who invent them and introduce them to the worship of God in the Christian church? Adam Clarke at this time said, "I'm an old man. I'm an old minister. I'm here to declare that I never knew them productive of any good in the worship of God, and have reason to believe they were much evil, productive of much evil. Music as a science I esteem and admire, but the instruments of music in the house of God I abominate and abhor. This is the abuse of music, and I here register my protest against such corruptions." Anyway, he goes on. The late venerable, most intimate divine, problems the way he says that, Revelation, John Wesley. John Wesley was the founder of the Methodist Church, who was a lover of music and eloquent poet, would ask his opinion of instruments of music being introduced in the chapels of the Methodists, said in his terse and powerful manner, "I have no objections to instruments of music in our chapels, provided they are neither heard nor seen. I say the same, though I think the expense of purchase had better be spared." And so anyway, Adam Clarke doesn't believe that David was authorized to do this. I see nothing from God that ever said that David was wrong in what he did. And the fact is, when David did wrong, was he always called out on it? He was, wasn't he? I mean, when he'd do something wrong, God would send a prophet to tell him that was wrong. There's no prophet sent to David on this. So I don't believe it's wrong. The other thing we have is in 2 Chronicles 29:25. Now, this is when Hezekiah, things hadn't been done right, and Hezekiah is issuing reforms. And they're going to start worshiping God the way they should, on the law of Moses. And so he sets up things in the temple to be back the way it should be. Gets rid of the idols that was in the land. And in 2 Chronicles 29:25, it says, "And he stationed," this is Hezekiah, "the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals, harps, and lyres, according to the commandment of David and of Gad, the king's seer," one of the prophets of that day, "and of Nathan, the prophet, for the commandment was from the Lord through his prophets." So it really seems here that it wasn't just David acting on his own, that David had authority from God. These other prophets also instilled this in Gad and Nathan. And so I don't believe what David did was wrong, but everything he said about why to be wrong today is true. because we would have no authority. The reason they had authority to do this in the temple was because David, through divine providence, God had revealed it to him, these prophets, had the authority to command this from God, that this is the way it should be. But it was very specific. So what instruments could they have? They could have cymbals, harps, and lyres. No others. And only certain people could play them. And it was done in a very orderly fashion when they could play them, when they couldn't play them. God was very specific. That makes sense, though, doesn't it? What could be done at the temple, what the priests had to do, those things were spelled out. What you had to do if you were impure, if if you come across a dead body, there were certain things, sacrifices you had to offer up. Everything was down to every minute detail in the law of Moses and in the way things would be done in the temple, the way the temple would be built, the way it was set up. And so it would make sense that it would be this specific. And yet we have in the New Testament, I think, just as specific what we're to do. We have more flexibility because we don't have to go to Jerusalem, but it's still very specific. What's your thoughts? Did David sin, or was this something that God obviously had authorized him to do?
My understanding wasn't something that God asked for.
Well, what's this about where it says it was a commandment from the Lord then?
Is it just an okay? Or,
Well, it's not like, it doesn't appear to be like, divorcing. That was something that God kind of allowed, but that wasn't ever his intent. There's never anything said about this other than what is said at the time of Hezekiah, that it came from David, from Gad the prophet, from Nathan the prophet. So if David sinned, these two prophets sinned as well. But it says, for the commandment wasn't from them, it was from God through his prophets, through David, Gad, and Nathan. God had revealed to them, is what this says. So either this verse is in error, or David didn't do anything wrong. I don't think David did anything wrong because nothing's ever said of it. And what Amos is misapplied there, because he wasn't really talking about a sin of David. He was talking about David had invented these instruments, well, to be used. But if David had authorization to do this, there was nothing he did wrong. But people in time of Amos were doing things, inventing instruments to be used that David had not authorized from God's commandment. So it doesn't seem to me that Amos is calling out David. He's calling out these new age people that were doing things without authorization from God. That makes sense? But a lot of times people have used that Amos 6:5 in a way that really wasn't meant. To me, Amos 6:5 has no bearing at all on whether or not we should use instruments or not, because it's not talking about the New Testament. It's talking about things under the old law. It's talking about the way they were not worshiping God correctly at the time of Amos. Malachi also talks about how they would bring. So when they offered an animal up for sacrifice, what were they to bring? Supposed to be without spot and, well, yeah, they were to do that too, but without spot and blemish, and it was to be the best. Malachi talks about at the time they weren't given the best, they were given the worst. So, if it was a sickly animal, if it had spot and blemish, whatever, that's the animal because they couldn't use it anyway. It wasn't any good to them. So they weren't doing things the way they should at the time of Amos. And that's really what the context is about. It's not about David doing anything wrong. It's that they tried to be like David. Well, what was the difference in them and David? David was oftentimes an inspired person. David had prophets around him that were also inspired. So, totally different scenario, I believe. Doesn't really matter much, but with David, the other thing I would add with David, as much as when he did something wrong, it was spelled out to David and to those around him. This wasn't. And so I don't believe that David acted alone. And so this was God had set this up, that this is how it should be run. Um, and it should be an orderly thing. Even in the New Testament, how is our worship to be? Does Paul not say it should be done decently and in order? It shouldn't be just a frenzy or free for all. There should be some thought to it. There should be a structure to it. Now, we've not given what that structure is, but it should be thought out, a structure to it. Um, you know, uh, Appreciate Steve. When he gets up and leads singing, he goes totally different than what everybody else does, but it's still the same orderly structure, is it not? We sing, we pray, we do the Lord's Supper, there's a sermon. Those things still take place. How they take place is not really important. We need to pray. My opinion is we probably don't do enough praying. We probably don't do enough singing. We probably don't do enough preaching, really. We probably don't stay as long as we, in the first century, they stayed a lot longer when they came to worship God.
Well,
Yeah, it was important. So, it would be great if we, as a collective, started having that attitude of this isn't long enough. We need to do more. But I do think, as a percentage, I think our prayers are probably not as much as they should be. Wednesday nights, I don't know if it was called that here, but in a lot of places, if you go back far enough, it wasn't called Wednesday night Bible study. What was it called? It's called prayer meeting. Prayer meeting, yeah. So when I hear that, I wasn't really ever around when they had a true old-fashioned prayer meeting. But my guess is, what did they do a lot of? Prayers. So we probably don't say percent-wise prayers like we perhaps would be better. Of course, to do that, you need to have more men to say the prayers. You need to have the intention to what prayer means. But anyway, that those are little things. The important thing is that you do have prayers. The important thing is that you do have singing, that you have some type of teaching that goes on. Those are things that should be done. And if you don't do those things, or if you have a very chaotic, like some believe that you can still speak in tongues, which, that age is left. And anyway, it's not decent and ordered by any means. Any thoughts on that? I think our time is up. So next week, what we'll do is we'll get into King Solomon and all those type things. So be good to be here. We will get into Solomon, how he begins. He begins wonderful. And then he runs into some problems in the middle part of his life as king. And then I think he returns at the end. And the reason I believe that is based on Ecclesiastes, which was written when he was probably quite a bit older. You probably already know, what was Solomon's biggest downfall? What was King Solomon's biggest downfall? What caused him the most problems? Solomon reigned during a time of peace, prosperity, no war. But what was his downfall? He had wisdom to rule the people, and he did that. But what led Solomon astray?
David.
Well, David's dad. David, in fact, a lot of the punishment for Solomon wasn't as severe because
Son of Dad. Okay.
Yeah. So what was Solomon, King Solomon? What was his downfall?
they married a bunch of women.
Oh yeah, he had. I think if you add up the women and concubines, it's almost 1,000.
How much?
1,000. Yeah, you heard that right.
Pretty
Yeah.
good man, huh?
Yeah. Well, he. But what were a lot of these women? Where were they from? Different places of the world. A lot of it was done for political favors and for gifts and other things. And so these were not God-fearing women. They were idolaters. And so he would build them their little thing for their God and other things, and eventually it did lead him astray. So we'll get into that. But David had an arc of being a man after God's own heart. When he messed up, he really turned back. Solomon has a different arc. Starts off great, and then has his downturn because of these things, and it cost him his descendants 10 of the tribes in essence. And so, but I think Solomon did come back to his senses. The end, read Ecclesiastes, and that explains Solomon's life and how he realized